Okay, good morning. Hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving. My name is Evan Wiener, and start this thing here in a
There's
second.
something else doing today. You think there'd be people here?
Now, I heard there's another event that's going on, right? 2 events at the same time. Anyway, in 4 days, it's going to be Pearl Harbor Day. It's going to be the 81st anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and if my math is correct, the youngest guys there who are at Pearl Harbor now are 98 or 99 years old. And there are very few people who are left from Pearl Harbor. That is the Honolulu Star Bulletin. War declared on Japan by the U.S. But do you know what date they declared war? December 8th, not December 7th. This is a talk about 1942. And on January 1st, 1942, America was at war. It was the 24th day of war for America, and they are trying to catch up to speed in a war that started in the Pacific, say, like 1938, Japan and China, and in 1939, September 3rd, 1939, 2 days after Germany invaded Poland. So here are the players in 1942, Franklin Roosevelt. The Axis countries. America at war. Congress is prepared to lower draft age from 20 to 18 years old. Internment camps start in both Canada and in the United States. The WACs were formed. That's my wife in front of a WAC uniform. That is Camp Shanks, so was Camp Shanks. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Camp Shanks, but if you had fathers who were in World War II in the European or North Africa theater, after 1943, they left to go there from Camp Shanks, which was up in Orangetown, New York, Rockland County. Automakers have to change. Pontiac is no longer putting out cars, nor is GM, nor is Chrysler, and all the other car companies. Rationing would come to American homes. Buy war bonds, help support the war effort. The war in Eastern Europe had been going on for 2.5 years at this point. The war in the Pacific, maybe you could say, started in 1938. By the way, 1938, the International Olympic Committee awards Sapporo, Japan, the 1940 Winter Olympics. There's war between Japan and China, which means Sapporo is not going to get the Olympics. The 1940 Olympics, had there been no war in Europe, would have ended up in Munich, Germany, Nazi Germany, for the second time in 4 years, because the International Olympic Committee said, hey, let's give Munich the Olympics. Not only that, they also decided the 1944 Olympics should be in Italy, Mussolini's Italy, International Olympic Committee. The Manhattan Project begins in 1942, which would ultimately lead to the atomic bomb. But that's Pearl Harbor. That is Pearl Harbor, and that is where America decides to get into the war. 1941, America is preparing for war. The Pentagon, construction on the Pentagon begins. The War Department, they need an area where they can house everybody right across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. Pearl Harbor happens on December 7th, 1941. 24 days of fighting. Americans have to catch up. America entered the war more than 2 years after it started, or at least the European piece of the war started. On September 3rd, 1939, 2 days after Germany invaded Poland, France and Britain told Germany, get out. They refused, and it was France, and it was England, and Australia, New Zealand, Canada, British Commonwealth that declared war on Germany along with the French. Japan launches what is thought to have been a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Much of the U.S. naval fleet was damaged or destroyed. Ultimately, 2,400 Americans are killed. And that is roughly what Pearl Harbor looked like on December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor is an interesting place. The Americans, around 1840, decided, as part of their manifest destiny and expansion and all that other stuff, the Americans decided this place, Hawaii, might be a good place for us to set up shop. And the Americans were involved. Hawaii is over. The Queen of Hawaii is overthrown around 1893. The Americans would annex Hawaii. And there is this harbor in Oahu, near Honolulu. And the Americans spent millions upon millions of dollars straightening out the place and set up a military station in Oahu, in the territory of Hawaii. The Americans always knew, or at least knew from 1840, this would be a strategic place. The attack starts at 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time. It is probably a 5 or 6 hour time difference. At that point, probably 5 hours. So it'd be 12:48 Eastern time. The base is attacked by 353 Imperial Japanese fighter planes, bombers, and torpedo planes in 2 waves launched from 6 aircraft carriers. All 8 Navy battleships are damaged. 4 are sunk. All but the USS Arizona were later raised. 6 returned to service and went to fight the war. Hyde Park. I was up there in 2017 and 2018, and I do other talks. I do talks on, well, the 1936 Berlin Olympics and why Roosevelt decided to legitimize Hitler's regime, which the 36 Olympics did, and send athletes there. And he said, well, athletes shouldn't really be fighting this war, so to speak. I worked with Marty Glickman. How many of you knew who Marty Glickman was? Marty Glickman was a sports announcer, did the New York Knicks, invented basketball play-by-play announcing on radio, did the New York Giants and Jets. I worked with his broadcast school in 1988. And I knew Marty, and I was talking to Marty one day. I said, did Roosevelt make the right decision? And he said, yes. He was one of 6 or 7 Jews that went to Berlin in 1936. He said he was the fastest kid in Brooklyn. That was the title of his book, Fastest Kid in Brooklyn. He was 18. And he said, I wanted to win that relay race, which he never ran. He said, I wanted to take that medal and shove it right in Hitler's face. So he agreed with Roosevelt. And I do a talk on the early days of TV, and Roosevelt was one of the first people on TV. And also commercial TV. And also he allowed baseball to go on in 1942. And I'll get to that in a couple of minutes, but I want to know why. Early afternoon on December 7th, 1941, Roosevelt meets with his chief foreign aid, policy aide, Henry Hopkins. And they get a phone call from the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson. And he said the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. About 5 o'clock that afternoon, following all kinds of meetings with military advisors, FDR calmly and decisively dictated to his secretary, Grace Tully, a request to Congress for a declaration of war. A president cannot declare war, but Congress can. On December 8th, Roosevelt goes to Capitol Hill, asking for the permission to start the war. He called December 7th a date that shall live in infamy, and told the U.S. Congress that the nation was in grave danger. A date that will live in infamy, which is a saying. It's now 81 years old, but school kids learn it, right? A date that will live in infamy. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Congress voted to go to war, and that's on December 8th, 1941. Only one member of Congress, Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, voted against the declaration. She was a pacifist. She's the first woman in Congress. And she also voted against the U.S. entering World War I. 1968, there's an anti-Vietnam protest, January the 19th or 20th, 1968, led by Jeanette Rankin, who was in Congress by that point for about 50 years. America ends its isolation policy. Americans were isolationists with the exception of World War I, where they got involved. And that is Pearl Harbor and one of the exhibits at Pearl Harbor today. The territorial governor of Hawaii declared martial law. All authority was turned over to the military, which proceeded to remove persons from military-sensitive areas, set curfews, regulated night driving, censored newspapers and radio broadcasts, and control prices on everything, from groceries to prostitutes. Now, I want to know something about this prostitution thing. How do you control prices on prostitutes? Aren't they freelance workers who don't report the income? But they did. Civil courts were closed and the writ of habeas corpus was suspended. And people started to volunteer to go into the military service on December 8th, 1941, like this guy, Hank Greenberg. He is the first baseball player to, and he's re-enlisting in the Army, to go in on December 8th, and he's not the only one. I knew his son, I know his son Steve, and we were talking about a whole bunch of things one day, and Greenberg was not a religious person. Ethnically, he was Jewish, but he's not a religious person. And Steve told me that 38, 39, 40, 41, whenever he was playing, every time he saw a baseball with the bat, he thought he was hitting Hitler right in the face, hitting the ball. Hank Greenberg. Anyway, the Detroit baseball star from the Bronx, James Monroe High School, in case anybody went there. My mother-in-law went there, but she was 10 years younger than Greenberg. Anyway, he's discharged from the Army in early December 41, as were all men who were over the age of 28. He was over 28. But 2 days later, Pearl Harbor is attacked. He's dismissed on December 5th. And Greenberg voluntarily re-enlisted and requested to be assigned to the Army Air Corps. He was not the only one ready to fight for his country. And that is December 11th, and there is Hitler. On December 11th, both Germany and Italy honored the pact with Japan and declared war against the United States. America was quickly forced to get a military machine up and running. It wasn't really a military machine ready. Pentagon wasn't ready. They knew something was coming, but they weren't ready. So it's time to build a war machine. And you don't have very much time to do it. You have to get right in the middle of the battle. America quickly needed to raise, train, and outfit a vast military force. Same time, it had to find a way to provide material aid to hard-pressed allies. In Great Britain, they've been bombed repeatedly, with our motto, the London Blitzkrieg, and the Soviet Union. Meeting these challenges would require massive government spending. Conversion of existing industries to wartime production, construction of huge new factories, changes in consumption, restrictions on many aspects of American life. You said you were in 5th grade, so were you in rationing?
Oh yeah.
Did you get shoes? Shoes were rationed.
I was not worried about it.
You weren't worried about the rationing, but
I could wear my sneakers.
You could wear your sneakers, but there were blackouts.
Yeah.
There were blackouts. Government, industry, and labor would need to cooperate. Contributions from all Americans, young, old, men, women, would be necessary to build up what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Building a war machine, Granger Company. Remember December 7th, pointing at you, Japan. Keep America free, pointing at Hirohito. The primary task facing America in 1941 was raising and training a credible military force. Roosevelt and Congress approved the nation's first peacetime military draft, September 1940. So obviously they realize that America's isolation days may be ending shortly. By December 1941, the American military had grown to nearly 2.2 million soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. They're men. They're men. Okay. How about the women? Well, the WACs were formed. The Women's Army Corps, created as an auxiliary unit. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps on May 15, 1942, and they were converted to active duty status in the Army of the United States. The first contingent, 800 members of the WACs, began basic training at Fort Des Moines Provisional Army Officers Training School in Iowa. WACs weren't sent out to fight. They did the clerical stuff, the stuff that was necessary, plugging in phone calls, whatever it took. That's what they were going to do. They were trained in 3 specialties. The brightest and nimblest were switchboard operators. Next came the mechanics, and you had to have a high degree of mechanical aptitude and problem-solving ability. And the bakers, they were the lowest scoring recruits, but they needed them. Also, the waves. They come into action in 1942. The waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency services established by the United States Congress, signed into law by Roosevelt, July of 1942. The establishment of the waves made it easier for the Navy to fill clerical and office roles at home, in shore stations, while allowing men to return to sea duty. Also, there's a push. Get women into the workplace. We've lost all these men. Get women into the workplace. It's kind of interesting because women were pushing for suffragette. They wanted the right to vote. They were suffragettes. Get the right to vote by 1920. The flappers were partiers by night, businesswomen by day, and that all kind of ends with the Depression. Now women are being asked to go back into the workforce at places like the Chrysler plant.
Rosie the River.
Rosie the River there. That comes a little later. That's not quite, we're not quite there yet with Rosie the River there. The American economy had to be converted to war production. Millions of men and women entered the service, which meant changes in American life. The need for labor opened up opportunities for women and African Americans and other minorities. Here's another little clue for you all. It goes back to 1941. June 25th, A. Philip Randolph. Ever hear of A. Philip Randolph? Before there was Martin Luther King, there was A. Philip Randolph, who was a civil rights activist. And he goes to, he's planning a march on Washington, basically to get jobs for loyal Negro Americans in the defense industry. And anyway, this is, he meets with Roosevelt on June 25th, 1941, and he's got this march plan for July 1st, 1941. And Roosevelt signs an executive order saying that defense industry and contractors have to hire African Americans. The march goes on, but you know, Randolph got what he wanted. America at war. 8 cards for gasoline. There was a woman a few weeks ago, I was giving a talk in Scarsdale, and we're talking about the 8 cards, gas rationing. And she gets married in 1945, and she was 18, so that's 7, so she's 95. Mentally really sharp at 95. And she's talking about her wedding in 1945, and that she and her new husband decided to go to Niagara Falls, right? And I said, well, how'd you get there with the gas rationing? And she said, that was easy. All of her wedding gifts were 8 cards. I said, you realize that you could have been, you and your husband could have been arrested, spent 5 years in jail, $10,000 fine. Well, I'm not going to tell anybody now. Besides, it's 77 years later. And she said she had no idea. She just used the ration cards, she and her husband, to drive up to Niagara Falls. America at war. Don't you know there's a war on? Became a common expression. Rationing became part of everyday lives. Americans learned to conserve vital resources. They lived with price controls, dealt with shortages of everything from nylons to housing. They volunteered for jobs ranging from air raid warden to Red Cross worker. America at war. There you go, America at war. And that's rationing. And you kept your A card or whatever else in that little thing, and you went to your grocery store or whatever, and you presented your ration card, some money, and you got the items that you could get. In May, the U.S. Office of Price Administration froze prices on practically all goods, starting with sugar and coffee. War rationing books and tokens were issued to each American family, dictating how much gasoline, tires, sugar, meat, silk, shoes, nylon, and other items any one person can buy. A wartime edition of the American Woman's Cookbook contained revised recipes and gave advice on dealing with food shortages. Oh, by the way, even babies got ration cards. So I have a granddaughter, I have two granddaughters, one who's three and a half, and the other one's 13 months old. That 13-month-old would have had rationing points.
They have to eat.
You had rationing points. I bet you didn't even know it.
Oh, I did.
Oh, you did know you had rationing
Had
points.
rationing books.
Yeah, rationing books. Hey, look who's there. Donald Duck. This is a victory garden. Pests keep out. People are encouraged to grow food. Now, I do 43, 44, 45 talks as well. And I'm doing the 42 here because Pearl Harbor is 4 days away. And one person in Brooklyn said, empty lots in Brooklyn. If you can find an empty lot in Brooklyn, that's where the victory gardens were, that the neighbors kicked in and planted things. And I said, you mean more than a tree grows in Brooklyn? To conserve and produce more food, a Food for Victory campaign was launched. Eating leftovers became a patriotic duty, and civilians were urged to grow their own vegetables and fruits. Millions of victory gardens, planted and maintained by ordinary citizens, appeared in backyards, vacant lots like the one in Brooklyn that that woman told me about, and public parks. Also, here we go. These were posters, propaganda posters in a way. Make do or do without. Do with less so they'll have more, whatever is in that canteen. War production created shortages of critical supplies. To overcome shortages, war planners searched for substitutes. One key metal in limited supply was copper. It was used in many war-related products, including assault wire. The military needed millions of miles of wire to communicate on the battlefields. The military needed more guns and ammunition to do its job. Had to be fed. The Army's standard K ration included chocolate bars. There was a shortage of chocolate bars in the U.S. And by the way, anybody here eats Three Musketeers? Yeah, the formula was changed in 1945. Why? Vanilla and strawberry became too expensive. Chocolate wasn't that expensive. Anyway, well, chocolates go over to overseas. Cocoa production was increased to give you more chocolate. Sugar was another ingredient in chocolate. Sugar rationed to civilians, and these guys had no problems getting cigarettes. They got cigarettes, more cigarettes than they knew what to do with. Tires, wooden tires. That was put on cars because there was a rubber shortage. Why was there a rubber shortage? Well, Indonesia, which was the Dutch East Indies at that point, Indonesia was controlled by Japan. Couldn't get rubber from there. So you got wooden tires. American military needed millions of tires for jeeps, trucks, and other vehicles. Tires required rubber. Rubber was also used to produce tanks and planes, but when Japan invaded Southeast Asia, the United States was cut off from one of its chief sources of critical war product. Speed limits, gas rationing, forced people to limit their driving. This reduced the wear and tear on tires as well. A synthetic rubber industry was created. The public also carpooled and contributed rubber scrap for recycling. And there's that war ration book that you might have had, and you might have had back in the day. The United States government created a system of rationing, limiting the amount of certain goods that a person could purchase. Supplies such as gasoline and butter, sugar, and canned milk were rationed because they were diverted for the war effort. The war also disrupted trade, limiting the availability of goods. Like I said, the Dutch East Indies, or Indonesia, off limits from March of 42 to September of 45, and that creates the shortage of rubber as well. Rationing. Rationing. Here's your book, here's your money. Let's see if we got that. Yeah, we got that can of peaches. Yeah, you can have that can of peaches. Let's see what else we got here. We got that mustard. Yeah, you can have the mustard. And that was it. You got it. Americans received their first rationing cards in May of 42. The first card, war ration card number 1, became known as the sugar book. For one of the commodities you could get with the ration card was sugar. So American life changes. I wanted to talk to Roosevelt about that. Franklin and Eleanor were very good. They're very good hosts. And books, they were a little stiff, but didn't say very much. But you got your information if you knew where to look over at the library. January 1st, 1942, all sales of cars, as well as delivery of cars to customers who had previously contracted for them, were frozen by the American government's Office of Production Management. No more cars. The auto industry had to change. January 10th, the freezing order was amended to permit the sales of cars to people in 3 categories: U.S. Navy, Army, U.S. Marines, Commission, Panama Canal, and other certain government agencies, persons assigned to an AIJ or higher preference ratings, prime contractors with the Army and Navy for construction of defense projects with an A1 through J or higher rating. So it's time to make tanks and not cars. The American automakers began building tanks and trucks, airplanes, jeeps, torpedoes, helmets. Factories were stripped down to make way for new equipment, and many car parts were remetaled at steel mills for use in the war efforts. And if you have anything at home, bring them down. Wanted for victory. Waste paper, old rags, scrap metal, old rubber. Get in the scrap. Give a collector or give to a charity. Whatever you got laying around the house, try giving it to us. We'll find it, or if you give it to us, we'll try to find somewhere it can be repurposed and be used. In October, the U.S. government increasingly encourages U.S. citizens to donate and gather scrap metal and fabrics for the war effort. Scrap days are held throughout the country, asking ordinary people to take any scrap materials you can get your hands on and bring it to the local scrap merchant. Do you remember doing that? You did that as well?
Yeah, and the Boy Scouts.
In the Boy Scouts?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we did that.
You did that in the Boy Scouts.
Yeah.
The scrap metal would be used to create the raw materials needed to build tanks, guns, ships, desperately needed. One of the things when I went up to Hyde Park to find out about Roosevelt was about recreation and baseball. Baseball is so woven into the culture of the United States, whether it was Casey at bat at home, or Take Me Out to the Ball Game, or Abbott and Costello, who's on first, all part of the American culture. Baseball has a huge, huge role in the American culture. This guy, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, is the commissioner of baseball. It's 1942, and Landis and baseball, they don't know what to do. Should we play or shouldn't we play? January 14th, the baseball commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, sends a letter to FDR looking for guidance. What are we supposed to do? It's not only the 16 baseball teams, but there are about 300 minor league teams. What do you want us to do? And there's the letter that Landis sends to Franklin Roosevelt. part of it. If you believe we ought to close down for the duration of the war, we're ready to do so immediately. If you feel we ought to continue, we would be delighted to do so. We await your order. FDR responds. It's the green light letter. This letter is in the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York, Baseball Hall of Fame. There's also a copy at Hyde Park. And it's nothing official, it's just Roosevelt's opinion of what to do. I honestly feel that it would be best for the country, excuse me here for a second, best for the country to keep baseball going. Baseball provides a recreation which does not last over 2.5 hours. Anybody go to a baseball game lately? Lasts well over 3 hours. But then again, Roosevelt died in 1977. Anyway, to make a long letter shorter, and which can be gotten at very little cost. You can get a box seat for a playoff game at Yankee Stadium for $1,800, but Roosevelt, at least his class, could afford it. Incidentally, I hope that night games can be extended because it gives an opportunity to the day shift to see a game occasionally. Roosevelt says, play ball. This letter is known as the green light letter. It's not official. It wasn't an order. It was just a suggestion. And with that, the National Football League said, well, if they're playing, we're going to play. And the National Hockey League said, if they're playing, we'll play as well. And there'd be boxing matches. Blackout, 5 a.m. until dawn. Obviously, this is on an East Coast or West Coast northern city where the sun doesn't come up in the winter until 8:30, like Seattle. And you have a blackout till dawn. Do you have blackouts till dawn in the morning? And then you're off to school. Officials in some American coastal cities were well aware of their vulnerability to air attacks, although the German planes could barely get to England unless they had some base somewhere in the water. They weren't going to get here. But anyway, they began ordering practice blackouts long before December 7th. On March 8th, 1941, Seattle became the first major city to test out its blackout procedures. As a blackout drill in St. Louis, and that top picture is the skyline. The middle picture is the blackout, and you can see the blackout drills. That was December 14th, 1942. Its first test of the blackouts during World War II. German planes weren't flying in the U.S., but St. Louis, in the middle of the country, right, the absolute middle of the country, was preparing just in case. No night baseball in Brooklyn. Any Brooklyn Dodger fans here? No, you were a Brooklyn Dodger fan. They did start playing night baseball around 1938, Brooklyn at Ebbets Field. No night baseball, because New York officials thought the German planes came, Ebbets Field would be a big target with the lights on. Office buildings and apartment houses throughout the city were required to veil their windows. You have the blackout curtains? You had the blackout curtains. More than 15 stories high. Stores, restaurants, bars toned down their exterior lighting. Streetlights and traffic signals held their wattage reduced. Automobile headlights were hooded. Night baseball banned, and the Statue of Liberty's torch did not glow. There was no Statue of Liberty glowing. And by the way, who owns that island? New York or New Jersey? New York does. You ever notice the Statue of Liberty has her rear end turned to New Jersey? They didn't have to do that. They could have positioned it away, but her rear end is aimed at New Jersey. War bonds. Buy war bonds today. If you're in 5th grade, how do you buy war bonds? Do they have a special?
It's stamps.
You bought stamps.
Yeah.
It
Okay.
went around to everyone
In
the
school.
neighborhood.
Oh, and in school. They went around to neighborhood school, and okay, that's how you did it. Bonds were available, $25 to $100, $1,000, for 10 cents I guess that was you. People could also purchase stamps which were placed in a special album. When full, the albums were redeemed for a bond. War stamps were very popular with children, like you. You were what, about 10? 10?
Exactly.
10 years old? Radio and television. There was a channel in New York. In fact, there were 2 channels in New York. Channel 1, WNBT, which is now Channel 4, WNBC, and Channel 2, WCBW. Both of them had programming on December 7, 1941. In fact, CBS, or Channel 2, did a big program from Grand Central Terminal about the start, or at least the bombing of Pearl Harbor that night. April 1st, the U.S. War Production Board halts the manufacture of television and radio equipment for consumer use. On April 13th, the Federal Communications Commission, minimum programming time required of U.S. TV stations is reduced from 15 hours to 4 hours a week. And there was a lot of propaganda. In fact, the United States Office of War Information begins in 1942 on June 13th. Created by Roosevelt, Executive Order 9182. Through radio broadcasts, newspapers, posters, photographs, films, and other form of media, the OWI was the connection between the battlefront and civilian communities. Of course, they're not going to tell you what's going on. They'll tell you bits and pieces of what's going on. The office established several overseas branches, which launched a large-scale information and propaganda campaign abroad. And it was also the Voice of America that started. They began in February. The program was established as a World War II propaganda tool that would broadcast news of the war in an effort to fight against Nazi propaganda and help boost the morale of Allied troops abroad. There was also internment camps.
I'm at a lecture, that's
The
why.
Japanese internment camps, mostly on the, in fact, all of them were on the West Coast. There were not only internment camps in the U.S., there were also internment camps in British Columbia and Canada, also mostly in the Western Canada. On February 19th, Roosevelt signs the Executive Order 9066, and that's with the intention of preventing espionage on American shores. Military zones created in California, Washington, Oregon. Those states with large populations of Japanese Americans. The Roosevelt Executive Order forcibly removed Americans of Japanese ancestry from their homes. Most of them were American citizens, and that is what an internment camp looked like. And they would stay until long after the war was over. In all, there were about 120,000 people of Japanese descent in the mainland, including 70,000 citizens that would be interned. The internment camps also in Canada. After Canada's declaration of war on Japan, now remember, Canada is in this war since September 3rd, 1939. Many called for the uprooting and internment of Japanese Canadians under the Defense of Canada regulations. But there's more to this than just the war. Chinese, Japanese, the Brits who lived there, and they were Brits, who became Canadians, wanted to get Japanese and Chinese and South Asian immigrants out of British Columbia since the late 1800s. There had been calls for exclusion, and this is a Japanese internment camp. February 25th, 2 weeks after Roosevelt, Japanese Canadians were being removed for reasons of national security, stripped of their homes and businesses, and sent to internment camps in farms, mostly in British Columbia, west of the Rockies, and some other parts of Canada. Policy included theft, seizure, and sale of property belonging to Japanese Canadians, and included fishing boats, motor vehicles, houses, farms, businesses, personal belongings. Japanese Canadians were forced to use the proceeds of the forced sales to pay for their basic needs during internment. Meanwhile, the war itself It's not going very well initially for the Americans. On January 20th, the Nazis at the Wannsee Conference in Berlin declared the final solution to the Jewish problem.
Remember that?
Exterminate all the Jews. Doesn't matter where they are in the world,
Yes.
exterminate all. You start with relocation, but they were relocating Jews in Germany anyway prior to that. In later extermination, the Germans need laborers. Where are they getting the laborers? Well, from the people they're arresting. That is the Dachau concentration camp. The incarceration of increasing numbers of people in concentration camps assured the quantity of labor supply, even as the brutality of life inside the camps depleted the number of available laborers. The SS used gas chambers and other means to weed out prisoners who were unable to work. So if you weren't strong enough to do the Nazis' work, they got rid of you. The Americans, it's a poor start. After all, they're just getting involved. The war machine in Europe has been going on since 1939, in the Pacific since 1938. The Allies' attempt to intercept Japanese invasion fleet was defeated in the Battle of the Java Sea on February 27th. 5 Allied warships are lost. 1 Japanese destroyer is damaged. The Japanese landed at 3 points on Java February 28th, expanded their beachheads, and 20,000 Allied troops would surrender on March 9th. Japan took over Guam, American territory Guam, Hong Kong, Wake, Singapore, Philippines, American territory, the Philippines. Philippines and Guam come from Spain after the Spanish-American War is over, 1898. Japan's initial war plans were realized with the capture of Java, but despite the military triumphs, the Japanese saw no indication that the Allies were ready to negotiate peace. MacArthur leaves the Philippines. I will return. After struggling against great odds to save the Philippines from Japanese conquest, the U.S. General Douglas MacArthur abandoned the island fortress of Corregidor under orders from Roosevelt. Left behind were 90,000 American and Filipino troops, Filipinos who were American citizens after all, who lacked food, supplies, support, and would soon succumb to the Japanese offensive, which leads you to the Bataan Death March, which was a forcible transfer by the Imperial Japanese Army of about 60 to 80,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war from Bataan to Camp O'Donnell. Prisoners were forced to march. A lot of them died on the journey. Transfer begins April 9th after the 3-month Battle of Bataan. The total distance was between 60 and 70 miles. The Doolittle raid over Tokyo. First hint that the Americans could fight back. They really didn't do any damage. They raided Tokyo on April 18th, but the raid stunned the Japanese population, and the Japanese leaders promised, our mainland's never going to be attacked again. The Americans could do it. Far more important were the consequences of the U.S. intelligence service's detection of Japanese plans to seize Port Moresby and Toluga in the southern Solomons. And then there was the Battle of the Coral Sea in early of May of 1942. The U.S. and Japanese carrier forces battle in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Both sides suffer major losses. The U.S. Navy, for the first time, checked a major Japanese offensive, and that would set up the Battle of Midway and success in the Battle of Midway for the Americans. There was a decisive victory in air and sea battle between June 3rd and June 6th. Successful defense of a major base located at Midway Island dashed Japanese hopes of neutralizing the United States as a naval power. That battle would effectively turn the tide of war in the Pacific. Who did all the heavy lifting in Europe? What country? Soviets. Soviets did all of the heavy lifting. Partially because Hitler made a mistake. Let's go invade in winter, right? Let's go invade, right? Must have been the morphine that kicked in. Germany's march through Europe started on September 1st, 1939. Soviet Union launched a counteroffensive against the Germans in Stalingrad mid-November. They encircled the German army, more than 220,000 troops. The Battle of Stalingrad would eventually prove to be a decisive psychological turning point, ending a string of German victories in the summer of 1942. Isn't there a Neil Simon thing, 1942, with Biloxi, 1942? I'm sure there was a play or a movie, anyway. And that began the Germans' long retreat westward. And then there's this, the Battle of Milne Bay in the beginning. And the United States and Australia take on the Japanese. It lasts for about 12 days, August 25th through September 7th. The Japanese attempted to attack Allied airfields and underestimated the number of Allied troops there. The Japanese forces were forced, or Japanese, abandoned their attack, marking the first major battle in which the Allies defeated Japan during the land battle. And then there was Guadalcanal. That starts on September 13th. The Japanese launch a major offensive against the Americans. They sustain heavy casualties. On December 31st, the Japanese plan to withdraw troops from Guadalcanal after suffering heavy losses in a number of battles, and they would get out by February of 43. My father-in-law was in northern Africa, and he won a Bronze Star. He said he could have won the Silver Star. He saved a couple of people, and he said, you know, Bronze Star is good enough for me. Let somebody else take credit to get the Silver Star. He said, what am I going to do with Bronze Star or Silver Star after I got out? What was it worth? Nothing. So he said, I took the Bronze Star. Africa, October 23rd. British forces attacked the German army at El Alamein in North Africa. On November 4th, the German army in North Africa is in full retreat after suffering a comprehensive defeat in Egypt at the hands of the British 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery. This starts. Robert Oppenheimer. This starts. It's called the Manhattan Project. And it's a super secret project that only Roosevelt and a handful of others know about. His vice presidents never knew about it. January 19th, Franklin Roosevelt authorizes the atomic bomb project. In June, the U.S. Army established the Manhattan Project to handle, in its part, the atomic bomb project, and began the process of transferring responsibility from the Office of Scientific Research and Development to the military. In September, Lieutenant Leslie Richard Groves Jr. is appointed what would be the head of what would be called the Manhattan Project. He selected J. Robert Oppenheimer to head the project's secret weapons laboratory, and they had to really, really, really vet down Oppenheimer for this job. But he was the right guy for the job. No nonsense guy. Meanwhile, up in Boston, the Coconut Grove burns to the ground because even though America is at war, not everything stops. It's November 28th. The Coconut Grove, one of Boston's swankiest nightclubs, becomes an inferno, trapping hundreds of victims as they jam the club's exits. Less than 15 minutes, 492 people are dead, 166 injured, making the blaze the deadliest nightclub fire in U.S. history. We're coming to the end here because we're here in Casablanca, right? Humphrey Bogart. You know, I knew Humphrey Bogart's mistress, Farida Thompson. I should actually I should throw a picture of Farida Thompson when I knew her 20 years ago and all. But she carried on with Humphrey Bogart for about 20 years. He used to call her Pete. And they'd be at Newport Beach during the war. They'd be at Newport Beach on his boat, just drinking all day and all night. Farida could drink under the table. And Humphrey Bogart, before he married Laura Bacall, asked Verita to marry him. And she said, no, I got a husband in the service. I'm not sending him to you, John Wayne. And he married Lauren McCall. Rick Blaine, Humphrey Bogart, owns a nightclub in Casablanca, discovers his old flame, Ingrid Bergman, is in town with her husband, Victor Laszlo, Paul Heinfeld. Laszlo is a famed rebel, and with the Germans on his tail, Ilsa knows Rick can help get them out of the country, Morocco. In the movie, Humphrey Bogart's character never says, play it again, Sam. He never said, play it again, Sam. How many of you watched Casablanca and thought he said, play it again? Never did. The line's not in the movie. Ilsa, play it once, Sam, for old time's sake. Sam, the piano player, I don't know what you mean, Miss Ilsa. Ilsa, play it, Sam, play as time goes by. It was never mentioned playing against Sam. Bambi came out in 1941, still, like Casablanca, still watched by people 81 years later. It's an animated film produced by Walt Disney, based on a book called Bambi, released in 1923, Bambi, A Life in the Woods by Australian author and hunter Felix Salten. The film's released by RKO Radio Pictures on August 13th. The film does not perform well, it's the war, as Hope Disney lacked access to much of Europe where he wanted to sell the picture. I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas comes out in 1942, written by Irving Berlin, and of course sung by Bing Crosby. It's an old-fashioned, it's Bing Crosby or Irving Berlin, who happened to be Jewish, reminiscing about an old-fashioned Christmas setting, even though he was Jewish. The song was written by Berlin for the musical film Holiday Inn. And this film would give birth to the hotel chain Holiday Inn. A number of years later, it was named, the Holiday Inn was named after the film Holiday Inn. And it won the Best Composition Academy Award, Best Original Song at the 15th Academy Awards. First public performance of the song, Christmas Day. Bing Crosby on his NBC radio show, The Kraft Music Hall. Song initially wasn't received well. Performed poorly. Overshadowed by another song that Bing sung in the movie, Be Careful, It's My Heart. But by the end of 1942, White Christmas topped your hit parade chart. How many of you listened to your hit parade back in the day? There you go. Bob Hope's first overseas troop show was in 41. 9 months after the United States, or 42 rather, 9 months after the United States entered World War II, Bob Hope made his first overseas trip to entertain members of the armed forces. His travel was to Alaska, then a U.S. territory, required a special permit. I'm sure none of you have ever been in Whittier, Alaska, and actually I should put a picture up of Whittier, Alaska. The United States put a base in Whittier. Why? It's marine, it's not that cold. It's marine, and the city is, the city, there's one building in there, and everybody who works in the city lives in that one building, with 200 people who are connected to the cruise industry now. But there's a dense fog over that city. And if the Japanese tried to find it, they weren't going to find it before radar and all that other stuff. The Nazis tracked down Hope, knowing that if they could bomb the area that he was in, they could take out several Allied troops as well. Hope was offered the commission in the Navy as a lieutenant commander. But Franklin Roosevelt intervened, indicated that it was best if Hope continued to entertain troops for all the armed forces. The Brooklyn Americans hockey team, which played at Madison Square Garden, known as the New York Americans hockey team, say goodbye. 2 reasons. One is the bootlegger. Big Bill O'Dwyer is arrested, so they really have no owner, but they're continuing going. But secondly, and more important, hockey at that time, 99% of the players were from Canada, with the exception of Frankie Brubzak, who's from Minnesota. And they started going into the war in 1939, and there was a shortage of players, and Brooklyn had debt, no owner, no players, so they suspended operations after the 1942 season. The National Hockey League is left with 6 teams. The legacy, as we end up here, the greatest generation. Anybody read the book by Brokaw, The Greatest Generation? That's what he called it, the World War II generation. The term was meant as a tribute to the resilience and patriotic spirit of those who lived through the Great Depression and then fought in World War II. It was not until January 27, 1944, that the U.S. government informed the American public about the Bataan Death March. When it released sworn statements of military officers who had escaped. September of 1945, General Mashaharu Hama was arrested by Allied troops and indicted for war crimes. Because of that, on February 26, 1946, he's sentenced to death by firing squad and is executed on April 3rd, 1947. Hitler committed suicide in 1945. Germany surrendered in May of 1945. Japan surrendered September 2nd, 1945. Not long after the Manhattan Project's 2 atomic bombs hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. FDR died on April 12, 1945. He did not see the end of the war. How many of you knew soldiers who served in World War II who wouldn't talk about it? Father or
Oh, a cousin.
cousin? Did you ever talk about it? No.
Brother,
Brother?
cousins.
Cousins? Never talked about it. That's kind of, the people who did talk about World War II were stateside. And they were stateside, doing stuff that you needed to do in stateside. The guys who actually were involved in what the Pacific Theater or the European Theater did not want to talk about it. My father-in-law, couple instances he talked about it. I had a guy the other day, we're talking about 1943, and I asked him, he said, I had a cousin. He started talking about it when he was 80 years old. He kept it in for all those years. Americans' isolation policy ended. Women were in the service. At the end of the war, the Navy established 5 separation centers for the demobilization of blacks and for Navy nurses. The separation started October 1st, 1945, and within the month, 9,000 waves had been separated. By the end of 1946, almost 21,000 more were discharged. The waves continued until 1978. After World War II, the WACs had no legal re-employment rights, no peacetime component, or even active reserve. With these rights, jobs for women would become scarce during peacetime. Congress provided re-employment rights for the WACs and WAVES on August 9th, 1946. And that is Verita Thompson. That is Humphrey Bogart's mistress. 2008. She was 88 years old at the time. She always wore Coco Chanel outfits because she was friends with Coco Chanel, and she always got the samples because she was so small. They used to make it in sample sizes, and she had hundreds of that. And if you notice behind her, there were 2 busts of Bogan. And oh, that piano, Henry Mancini's piano. Verita was a runner-up Miss Arizona in 1937. Went out to Hollywood, tried her hand at the movies, was a stunt girl, then worked behind the scenes as a hairdresser and a wig maker. That is where she met Humphrey Bogart because he needed a wig. Casablanca launched Ingrid Bergman's career, established Humphrey Bogart as a romantic lead. It is Play It Again, Sam, and Casablanca is one of the most referenced films of all time, from Woody Allen's Playing It Again, Sam to the Muppets. Walt Disney once said of Bambi, it's the best picture I ever made, best ever to come out of Hollywood. Bambi. It's not a happy story, Bambi. It prompted acknowledgement of animal rights, showed the fearless world animals live in until the inevitable human intrusion. Time Magazine's review, Disney's indictment of men who kill animals for sports is so effective that sportsmen who have seen the picture are gunning for him. 1942 legacy, White Christmas. It has sold 50 million copies. The most by any artist. It's the biggest selling single of all time. The song established that there could be a commercially successful secular Christmas song market. Before 1942, Christmas songs and films came out sporadically. Many were popular. The name Holiday Inn ended up being used for the hotel chain. That's Boston during the fire. Following the Coconut Grove fire, there was a toughening of building codes. After the Pearl Harbor attack, the American government pumped money into Massachusetts General Hospital for burn research. They had an experiment in how quickly they can react after this. There were blood banks and reserve of plasma on hand, which were critical to reviving Coconut Grove burn victims. That's Bob Hope. In 1997, the U.S. Congress honored Bob Hope, declaring him first and only honorary veteran of the U.S. military armed forces. 48 Christmases overseas with American troops, his final show during Operation Desert Shield, Saudi Arabia in 1990. Major League Baseball made it through the 1942 season. The green light letter applied to other sports. The NHL never reinstated the Brooklyn Americans franchise. The era of the so-called original 6 teams lasted 25 years until the league added teams. That is 1942, The Voice of America, and it's still in use. This year it was used as a propaganda tool in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, a pro-American message to those in Russia who could pick up the broadcast. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? The floor is all yours now. Anybody?